Hi everyone. First of all, I acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra, and Birapai peoples of Australia, the traditional custodians of the land on which our university campuses are located, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and extend that respects to all First Nations people who are joining us for this webinar today. So welcome everyone, and thank you for attending our July research seminar. And my name is Nilufar. I co-organize SICS seminar series with my colleague Victoria here. Today, we are delighted to welcome our special guest, Ms. Kyrstal Gagen-Spriggs, lecturer and PhD candidate in teacher librarianship at the School of Information and Communication Studies. Krystal's doctoral research explored the factors that affect teacher librarian influence on reading cultures in secondary schools. And she's going to share findings from her doctoral thesis and present about conceptual model of teacher librarian influence. So I will hand over to you now, Krystal, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Nilufar. I hope you can all see my screen.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here to share what I've been working on during my special studies program time. The thesis got submitted on Friday last week. Woo! And this is, one of the big things that came out of that I'm particularly proud of. So, yeah, I'm excited to share this with you today. Before I do get into the nitty-gritty of the presentation, though, I too would also like to acknowledge the various countries upon which we are all beaming in from today. For me personally, that is Meanjin, which is Turrbal and Yagara country up here in Brisbane. I also pay respects to the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Birapai peoples of Australia, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which CSU's campuses are located. And I always share this phrase. I know that many of you will be very familiar with this phrase, but I always share it because I think it's just beautiful and truly embodies what teacher librarianship, but what the university is all about. So, Yin Yamara Wanangana, the aim for us all to learn the wisdom of respectfully living well in a land worth living in. So, just a reminder, because I know it's been a while since I've had the opportunity to talk to you about the research that I've been doing. This is just a quick snapshot of the thesis project. The original question was, what factors affect the teacher librarian's influence on reading cultures in schools? And I had 3 sub-questions to help me answer that. I used a critical realism paradigm, which I did not realize how perfect it was going to be when I started out, but it absolutely shaped and informed my research. And I think it was just such a beautiful synergy between what I was trying to do and what I ended up doing. So I do love me some critical realism. That it was a mixed method, multiple case study. I did some quantitative surveys. I got way more into stats than I ever thought I would, but that was a good learning experience. I did some qualitative interviews and I also collected some digital artifacts from the schools that I was engaged with in the research. Now, I will say I've taken a slightly different approach to this presentation because I decided to be a bit more creative with the way that I am telling this story and the data and the findings. So I'm sure you'll pick up on the theme as we go through. A tale of 3 schools. So we had 3 schools that were involved in this research. I, in the thesis, call them School A, B, and C, but that was, not overly interesting and exciting for today, so I renamed them. We have Arcadia Academy, we have Briar Rose High, and Clockwork College. The 3 schools are all within the Queensland Southeast region area. They have been de-identified. The data, the demographic details that you see in front of you are reflective of the schools, but you can't go and find them if you did some looking. Interestingly, I ended up with all 3 Catholic schools, despite not trying to do that. It was just a result of the way that participation happened, the inclusion exclusion criteria, and just luck of the draw, really. And I also ended up with two schools, Arcadia and Clockwork, that are fairly similar, with Briar Rose being quite different in the middle. And that was really interesting. That helped me to compare contexts, which is such an important part of any education research. It's such a foundational element of critical realism, and it really truly informed everything that I, found and am recommending, or the model in particular, which we'll get to later. Also, interestingly, is the library resourcing. The number of items per student. Unfortunately, at Arcadia Academy, they did not provide me with the number of non-fiction resources. They only had the fiction resources. So these numbers that you see at the bottom of each profile don't include the non-fiction resources. And so when you are looking at the number for Briar Rose in the middle, 29.68 items per student, compared to the other two schools that have 4-ish per student, is mind-blowing to me. And one of the things that speaks to, I think, is the socioeconomic advantage side of things. You'll note in the governance and demographics that both Arcadia and Clockwork are in the top range of the socioeconomic scales that ACARA, the Australian Curriculum and Assessment Reporting Authority, use to determine the level of advantage, socioeconomic advantage a school has. And so while Briar Rose is technically above the national average, it is less than the other two schools. But interestingly, it has the higher number of resources per student. So that in and of itself was quite interesting. When we're talking about, where all of this data comes from, they're color-coded for the different schools. You'll notice that anytime I mention Arcadia, it's yellow, Briar Rose is orange, and the Clockwork College is red. So the data from this presentation comes from interviews with the 3 teacher librarians, the 3 principals, a whole bunch of students, and some teacher interviews, as well as some of the open-ended responses. So I managed to get a nice rounded picture of what was happening in each school. And I really think that came through in the data, the different perspectives, the different experiences. So that was really important to me. And it's also, foundational for critical realist research. You want to be able to capture the big picture so that you can see what's happening systemically or structurally. So speaking of critical realism, there were a number of frameworks that I did use to guide this research. It sort of happened organically. I have always been fascinated by the transactional theory of reading. That's the aesthetic efferent type of reading. So reading for meaning is efferent reading. That's that academic reading. And then aesthetic reading is reading because you want to experience it. And that is how I have been defining the kind of reading that I've been investigating in the reading culture. By framing it through that aesthetic lens, it doesn't limit me to fiction. It doesn't limit me to print. It doesn't limit me to, written word. It allows me to encapture all of the different types of reading that people do for an aesthetic purpose, that reading because they want to, reading because they want to get something out of it, that feeling. So that was my starting point. And then through the literature that I was reading and, designing the research and everything, brought in some self-determination theory because, that is such a key part when we're talking about why people do things. The enabling adult is something that has been foundational for the teacher librarian community for 20 plus years now. And that certainly formed the foundation of my investigation regarding like teacher librarian position and ability and agency within a school library. What was really interesting was when I brought in the critical realist frameworks, the stratified reality in particular, which is, from the father of critical realism, Bhaskar. He has this approach where reality has three different layers, and you can only truly understand what is happening in reality by unpacking those three different layers. And then Archer's work builds on that by looking at how context plays within the critical realist stratified reality approach, and looking specifically at the way that context, people engage it on three different. I don't know what is with the three, but anyway, three different ways. So context from a structural perspective, a agency perspective, and a culture perspective. So keeping those three things in mind, plus the way that Bhaskar stratifies reality, really helped me to unpack the different layers and levels of what was happening in each school. And that then resulted in this conceptual model of teacher-librarian influence. But before we get to the model, I wanted to share with you what I'm calling the omen, the signal, the thing that, teacher librarians and many Australians are aware of at the moment, and that is all the talk around reading. Whether Australians read, whether they don't, whether they're good at it, blah, blah, blah. It is an ongoing discussion in many different forms. I have used reading identity in my research to be able to explore how identity, shapes a student's receptiveness to the school's reading culture. But there are many other ways that researchers have been describing or typologies of reading, categorizing readers. And so I've brought together two of the more recent Australian ones alongside my own identity classifications. So the Australia Read ones, they are from adults, a study done recently with adults, and it is fascinating. It focuses in on behavior. So they've got kind of like the label, the avid reader, but then the label underneath it, the daily devotee, is more of that label behavior, behavior label. So that was really helpful for me to understand that they were differentiating their categories based on how the behaviors were being performed. And then the teen reading, they based theirs on just general attitudes and descriptions of engagement and feelings and that sort of thing. So we sort of have three different approaches, I suppose, to categorizing readers, but ultimately they do align. We are all sort of saying similar things, just with different language and different lenses. So that was good for me to be able to say, yep, mine do align with the other findings of two national projects out there, which was really affirming, and also gave me a bit more language to be able to explain the different identities. So in the research that I did, I categorized all the students who did the survey into my four originally identities. And then through the interview process, I was able to interview students from each identity, and that was what brought the non-reader to the fore through the qualitative interviews. I managed to snaffle someone I had labeled a reluctant reader, but in talking with them, I realized, yeah, no, you're not reluctant, because reluctance implies that there is the possibility you are non-reader, absolutely not going to do it. And that was, reflected also in the Australia Reads and teen reading projects in their book abstainers and their uninterested non-readers, with all the usual caveats around samples and who would do a survey about reading, of course. So I had 100 students across the three schools end up doing the survey that I sent out. It was the Adolescent Motivation to Read Profile Survey, and I used just the part A of it, the first part, which is a quantitative survey, and it asks students 20 questions that they have to respond to on a scale of 1 to 4. So it's purposefully designed to not allow them that wishy-washy middle ground. And I know that, Likert scale surveys often have that middle ground because, you do want to have that middle ground. But in this survey, it is purposefully designed to force the respondents to choose either way. And so what I did is it scored out of 80. And what I did is I took the total score and I divided it up mathematically to then be able to use those boundaries to categorize students as avid, proficient, struggling, and reluctant. So basically starting at 40. So reluctant readers were categorized off the top of my head between receiving scores of 40 to 50, I think, 60, 70, 70, 80. Yes. So that's how I came up with this number. And then I used that categorization to then identify students who I would like to speak to in a follow-up interview. I didn't have any particular way of choosing those students other than just, random. Hey, look, you're an avid reader. I want to talk to you. And I picked a few and I asked the teacher librarian to get in contact with them. And of course, there was all the usual consent and parental consent and all of that stuff, which filtered things down a little bit. And in the end, I did manage to speak to students that were from each reading identity, plus also that reluctant reader who I mentioned I reclassified as a non-reader. So yeah, it is unsurprising to me that the proficient reader category was the largest. The the data and everything about Australians and reading does tell this tale of people in Australia can generally read. They choose not to. They choose not to for a variety of different reasons. And what was really obvious to me in talking to the proficient readers in particular was there are some clear systemic reasons that these young people are choosing not to read. And there's not a whole lot we can do about those things. So that was really interesting. So, for example, when students said things about reading, it was, I like it, but I don't get time for it. I used to be passionate about it. Holly says, on reading during spare time, it depends on how I'm feeling. That feeling and that mood and that energy was such I'm going to use the young people's vernacular, vibe from everyone. They just, it just depends on how I'm feeling, how exhausted. That was often a comment, how tired I am, how exhausted I am, what everything else that I've had to do in that day. So, these young people are reporting this systemic institutionalized basically exhaustion, and then no wonder they don't go home and read, because reading is a difficult thing to do. It requires active participation. It's not something you can do passively. Izzy says, I like a book when it's a book I like reading, when it's a book that I enjoy. When it's something is like forced on me, I don't love reading. And Alex says, I used to read back in primary school when I had a lot more spare time. I don't so much anymore because I have, stuff on like assignments and exams. And also Alex said that reading would be just another commitment. And in talking to these students, yes, I was talking to private school students, so they do have generally have a large variety of extra or co-curricular activities available to them, and they are often doing things like sport and music and gymnastics and artistic stuff and all sorts of things. These kids are scheduled to the max. And so I thought Alex's point about it would be another commitment was just such a truth, a home truth for these young people. So what I did with the results from the survey, the way that the Adolescent Motivation to Read profile survey works is that not only does it score students out of 80, but it also alternates each question to measure each student's score on their self-concept as a reader, so how they see themselves as a reader, and also the value that they place on reading. And what I did is I took those scores and I then plotted them on my scatter graph here, and then I overlaid what I am sort of referring to as the reading identity matrix, which is charting how they are trending towards avid or reluctant, struggling, proficient based on their value and their self-concept of reading and as a reader. It is interesting that if we think back to that graph that showed the 4 different identities, the proficient reader category looked quite large, but when you're looking at this diagram here, The avid reader quadrant in the top right there looks like it might be the more dominant quadrant. And I like that juxtaposition because it tells the story that I think sometimes we need to realize that this idea of identity, the way that students see themselves as readers, the value they place on readers, it has different elements. And so what you'll notice is that students are on the right-hand side more because that is the self-concept. It's higher self-concept. And so if they see themselves as good or decent readers, they will be on that higher end of the scoring scale, which is why the right two quadrants are, they've got more students. Each one of those is a student who did the survey. And then, on the left side, it's the not such a good reader. And then as we go vertically up, that's where the value comes into it, how much they value reading. And so there is this sort of little, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's this sort of cluster here, which are the borderline high middle value of reading that see themselves as a good reader, they see the value in reading, but not quite as much as those who, really, really love it and really, really do it. And that I think it was one of the key things because if a student can see the value in reading, if they know what it does, if they've had positive experiences, then there's the potential to get in there and influence them, to engage with them about reading if they see it as something valuable. So this reading identity matrix I'm really quite proud of it. I hope it makes sense to you, but it was really quite tricky for me to figure out how to visualize this. And yeah, I think it came out okay. The other things that I looked at were the way that staff felt about the reading culture within their school. These are the results of each individual staff member who did the survey that staff were asked to do. It was based on the Reading Health Survey. I tweaked it a little bit for it to be an instrument for data collection in this sort of situation with permission from the original authors. Ginny Lowe was very kind to let me use that. And so this graph here, I apologize for people who have very strong opinions about when lines on graphs should be used, but the way that I've done it here is that each column represents each individual's response to a specific question. That question asked them to rate their school's reading culture from 1 being non-existent to 5 being excellent. And then the purple squiggly line is charting each participant's mean overall survey score. And I did this because it was interesting to me to see that some people, take Alice for example, Alice, when asked to rate the school's reading culture, she gave it a 2 out of 5, which means she rated it as poor. And yet when I did the analysis of all of her other responses, she came out as an average of 3. So even though she had been consistently picking middle-ish ground responses, when actually asked to rate it, she was more negative. Conversely, you've got ones like Hannah, who she's down here in the red. She, rated the the reading culture to be pretty on par with her mean score. So all throughout she was quite consistent. And then you've got the other ones here who say that their, reading culture is excellent, but their mean scores suggested that it was more good to not, so you can kind of see the discrepancy, I suppose, between the perception when asked outright versus when I then looked at all of their responses collectively. And that was really interesting because, funnily enough, the teacher librarians who did actually do the survey as well as the teachers would often rate their reading culture lower than others. And yeah, it was such a, I think it just gives a really good picture of what teachers see and perceive and what they believe about their school's reading culture. Some of the things that teachers said, Susan, who was a head of a religion department at one of the schools, said the reading culture amongst the people who do read is phenomenal. However, there is general disinterest from some of the students, and that made me think, can you then say that your school has a reading culture? Or is there a reading culture within your school? Is it a holistic, like a whole school reading culture, if it's great amongst those people who do read? Because if not everybody's engaged, then is it a whole school? And Natalie, English teacher, she sort of built on that and expands on that by saying a true reading culture should not be supported by the librarians or by the English teachers alone, but everyone's involved and everyone loves reading, and it's something that's valued and celebrated. So holistic. So Susan says we have a reading culture amongst the people who read, and Natalie says I want everybody to be reading, and it being a whole school reading culture. So even that comparison there, I think is really interesting to see what teachers think about reading cultures. I also, as I mentioned, collected some digital artifacts. I collected just over 1,000 across 4 different school accounts. These accounts were given to me with, the details were given as part of the expression of interest and agreement to do the research. So with Instagram's limitations around copyright and everything, I don't actually have these files stored. I've left the, copyright reasons, I can't download these images. So I have done a bit of a content thematic analysis of the images used in the posts as well as the content of the captions. And what I found is that the 3 official school accounts, their focus was more about communicating information about the school to the broader community, and it was very professional facing, which makes sense when you think about it. Their official social media account should be quite official and informational and all of that sort of thing. School C in this presentation called Clockwork College, they were the only one to have a library only social media account. And as you can see on their account, the focus is far more geared towards reading and library stuff, which makes sense, but also the community and the vibe and less about the institutional information. So that in and of itself is important because what kept coming through from interviews with students at Clockwork as well as with staff, they were saying that the library's account was just so very clearly an extension of the school library. It was a space for the students. It was a way to connect authentically. It was celebratory. It was student focused, and students did say, we felt represented and seen, and it felt authentic. When I asked students at the other 3 schools, do you follow your school's social media accounts? Most of them said no, because they said it's information that I already know. Why would I don't need to follow that. And when I asked some of them, would you follow a library account? They said, yeah, I might, because I can imagine that would be more geared towards me. Now, bearing in mind, I collected this data before the whole social media age of 16 ban thing, but I still think there is potential to use this approach of having a student-focused digital communication channel, whatever that is in each school, that celebrates students, that promotes students, that focuses on them, is something that is important and should be looked at. Now, the biggest thing that I found from this research is that the principal of each college, each school, is such a driving force for what is possible. I'm calling them the architects of the school. They create the vision, they give the direction, they provide the overall strategy, all of those things that then, the school must work within. And what was interesting is the three very different approaches for each principal. So Kelly of Acadia Academy, she said that, the teacher librarian role had been purposefully restructured in her time to focus more on supporting the school's archives and the school's research goals. The archives was a bit of a shock to the teacher librarian. The school does have quite a legacy, a history. It's got quite a lot of things, but the teacher librarian, when they were given this as part of their role, they kind of went, oh my gosh, how do I fit this in with everything else? Especially because we want to do research improvement too. And so, Acadia, Kelly of Acadia, there was a real focus on supporting the school's legacy, celebrating its history, but also viewing the library as an academic resource, the space, getting access to students over the holiday period so they could come in and do individual study in the library space, not necessarily with the library staff present because they weren't needed. They needed the space. Sally of Clockwork College also had a very academic focused perspective of the library, but hers was driven from a data perspective, evidence-based. She said in her interview that her remit coming in as a new principal a couple of years before I interviewed her was to drive academic outcomes. She was brought in to raise the results of the school. And, when we look back, you probably may not remember, but, the school profiles at the beginning of this presentation, both Arcadia and Clockwork had 100% of their Year 12 students achieving the Queensland Certificate of Education. Sally says that before she came along, that wasn't the case at Clockwork. So she had brought up, not just her personally, but, she had worked with the school to bring that number up to 100%. Then we've got Andy of Briar Rose in the middle, whose approach to the library is very different to both the other principals. There's focus on the school community rather than academics. Andy was talking a lot about finding and applying for grants and getting recognition and awards to sort of put the school out there and celebrate it externally to attract financial incentives and to be able to increase their enrollments by having the school name out there. Andy also was very open about the fact that she believed the library was the heart of the school, whereas, Kelly viewed it as an academic resource, and Sally was even talking about the fact that they're getting a new library and that, this was going to solve all their problems because it would make it modern and engaging and it wouldn't be tired and, dorky and all those sorts of things. So just the way that the principals talked about their school libraries was, again, really interesting and eye-opening. So if we're looking at the teacher librarians themselves, Helena is from the Arcadia Academy, and these are some of the things that she was dealing with and trying to do, the way that she responded to different situations. So, the isolation hex, the way that the principal had structured the teacher librarian role and the way that the library was viewed meant that Helena did not have direct contact with students very often at all. In fact, students said, we don't ever see her. If we do see her, she's walking from one end of the school to the other, or we see her at cricket because she manages a cricket team. But they don't actually see her in the library. And that is partially because of the way that her role was structured. Helena also reported feelings of imposter anxiety because she was asked to create a program that the English teachers were supposed to use. She was also one of the English teachers. She had a Year 7 English class, and she herself wasn't actually doing the program that she had designed for the English department because of time, curriculum challenges, and all that sort of thing. But, Helena did rely on her support staff, and she had tried to come up with more self-directed, automated ways for students to engage with the school library. Talia from School B, Briar Rose High, Talia's role was very different to the other two teacher librarians. It was very clear that because of Andy's ideas about the library and her direction for the school, Talia was supported and directed towards focusing on that community engagement. But what was really interesting about Talia is that she was doing all of this stuff. She was, she reads over 100 books every single year, and she always tries and gets books in for every single child. She personalizes things for everyone. But at the same time, she's exhausted. She's absolutely exhausted from that, trying to engage with each and every student on a one-on-one basis. Admittedly, her school with approximately 300 students does make it a bit easier for her to have that one-on-one contact with each student than a school with 900 plus, but it was exhausting, and she would often feel disheartened if she couldn't actually convert one of the students into a reader, because she's like, I've invested all this time and energy and it didn't work. So that was, Talia is doing all these amazing things and the principal is loving it, but at the same time, Talia is still feeling that compassion fatigue, that exhaustion. And then we have Hannah, who I've called the rogue. And Hannah is a rogue because Hannah her title got renamed from Program Leader of Library to Head of Library and Digital Services. And that shift in focus to including digital services made her feel really like an administrator, like, she was engaging with suppliers and troubleshooting and all of those sorts of stuff that she goes, this is not me. I want the wicked problems. I want to be solving the big things. And so while she was forced to deal with these things, data and supporting teachers and all that sort of stuff, she would still be trying to find subversive ways to be able to influence her school, even if she personally couldn't do it, which is where the digital bypass idea comes from. That is the Apologies, my mic just turned off. That is the social media account for that school library. And so, she was sort of using that as her way around what she was being forced to do. And also talked about, upskilling her library staff in areas to be able to fill the gaps that she could no longer do herself. But at the same time, noting that while she was doing that, it did not feel good. She did not like having to outsource these things. And so this brings me to the model. I went around and around in circles for ages trying to think about, again, how to visualize this, and I'm still not 100% entirely sold on the final here, but this is what we're working with for the moment. And so I have, identified 3 what I call elements of teacher librarian influence. And the one that I particularly am proud of is the idea of the filters. The idea that a person's agency gets filtered through certain things and has those filters then affect what they're able to do, the interventions that they are able to deploy. And that's an important thing to recognize and acknowledge in a school context, or in many contexts, but particularly in schools, because every school is different. Every school has different filters that the school community must navigate. So if we're breaking down the 3 different elements, agency, I am using the word influencer, but not as like social media influencer here. I just mean the person who is attempting to influence. And then the influencee, the person that they are trying to influence. And so understanding that it's a dual input. It's not a one-sided thing. Both parties have agency. The influencer has their own personal capacity, their own abilities, their own opportunities to adapt or accept or challenges or whatever it is. And then the influencee also has their own personal set of circumstances to consider. For example, their fluid, volatile reading identity, or how they are feeling within the environment, but most importantly, their autonomy and whether or not that is accepted or celebrated. So breaking it down into those two sort of sides is really helpful, I think, to be able to understand that it's not just who you're trying to influence, it's also what you are capable of. And teach librarians have different capacities based on the school that they're in and the role that they're in and all of those sorts of things. The filters, I've broken them up into 3 different categories. These are by no means exhaustive. They're just based on some of the findings from this research. So the idea that these things have an effect on what the teach librarian is able to do. Ideological, up first is the principal. What is their belief, their desire, their focus for the school? That is going to shape anything that happens in that school, no matter what. You just won't be able to do anything outside of what the principal wants and needs for that school. Cultural, that idea of how the school community views things, the responsibility that people take for things in the reading culture sense. Departmental siloing is that idea that it's the English department's responsibility or it's the library department's responsibility. But what ends up happening is something called the orphaned responsibility, where no one takes ownership of it because everybody is trying to do everything else, and then it becomes the students' responsibility, and they don't have the capacity, their ability, the cognitive function. They're exhausted. They can't fit it in. And then structural things. These are the things that are different in every single school, but you also, the actual structural filter itself is the same, but the way that it affects the school is different. So for example, how much time is allocated to reading? That's something that occurs in every school, but it's different for every school. The staffing model of the school library, again, there's staffing in, if the school has a library, then they've got staff generally, but how it's staffed is different. Same with the physical physical location and the way that they're able to communicate and all those sorts of things. So it's not an exhaustive list, and the model itself, I wanted to steer away from being, saying if you do this, 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 and line up this, this, and this, you are guaranteed to do this, because that's not how schools work. And the filters, I think, really help people, or they help me, to think about the challenges that each school has to overcome. And then the third element of the model is the interventions. I've put them into 4 different categories just to sort of help communicate how you might go about interventions. So thinking about ways that you could connect, because Talia at Briar Rose High demonstrates that relational currency, that one-on-one engagement with students does work. Creating a safe haven does work. Being authentic does work. So how are you connecting? And then how are you communicating? The Clockwork College with their library account, they are getting information out to their school students, their community, through the digital bypass by being authentic online and celebrating online. Collaborating, Talia at Briar Rose High had parent events where she would have book clubs with parents and students, and that would just bring reading not just to the students but also the wider community. So I think collaborate often makes people think colleagues, what department am I collaborating with, but broadening that to the wider community. And then finally, curate. The idea that school library collections are, stagnant books on shelves is something that we need to let go of. And most teach librarians have, but being able to communicate that to school leadership, to be able to argue for the value of a bespoke collection, why that's important, and why broadening our definition of reading and celebrating all different types of reading, the aesthetic experience rather than a particular type, that's all part of that curation. And so, just that idea that agency filters through gets filtered through different elements of the school, and the interventions themselves will also get filtered through those things, and your agency will depend on the interventions that you're able to do. So as you could tell, it's very complicated, and presenting that visually, bit of a trick, but hopefully that does go some way towards doing that. And so, you know, the original question is what factors affect the teacher librarian's influence on a reading culture within the school? And ultimately, if I was going to put a number on it, I would say these 4 things from my research. Student reading identity absolutely is a factor because it determines the student's receptiveness, their openness, their willingness to that influence. And teacher librarians need to be okay with some students not being open to that influence. The reading culture perception within the school community is also another factor, because if the school community doesn't value reading as a whole, or doesn't see it as something that's an everyday habit, or it's only worth celebrating once in book week, then that's going to affect the teacher librarian's ability to have influence. The systemic and structural factors, that's the time, the curriculum, the staffing, the policies, all of those sorts of things, those are factors that have an effect on the teacher librarian's influence. And lastly, probably most importantly, is the teacher librarian themselves. And this is something that is so important for the school library community, for teacher librarians. Your capacity, your ability, your agency is a factor in how or who you influence. And being, realistic about what your influence is and what you're capable of or what you have the capacity for is so important. And it's okay if your capacity isn't the same as someone else's in a different school, because you have different systemic and structural factors that you're dealing with. You've got different reading culture perceptions. So, acknowledging that, yes, it is a factor, you as a teacher librarian, but it's not the only one, but it is absolutely important. And so, finally, to wrap it all up, to bring it together, the original idea of the enabling adult within the teacher librarian community is such a near and dear concept to my heart, because it absolutely informed my practice as a teacher librarian. That idea of connecting the student to the right book at the right time. But it is a little passive in the way that it's framed. You provide access, you stimulate interest, you demonstrate reading, and you respond to reading inquiries and things like that. I have argued for a leveling up, an evolutionary step towards the empowering adult, to turn the idea of the teacher librarian into a more active role, that it's not enough to provide books. You actually have to be able to create interventions that not only provide books, but also then guarantees access to those books, gets the students into the library to access those books, and being able to identify what each individual student realistically. I know that doing that for 900 students is not realistically, but in an ideal world, identifying what each individual student needs and being able to give them that targeted support, that targeted result, that intervention that works for them. And so, yeah, the shift from enabling to empowering. Those are the references if anyone's interested in any of the theories or frameworks. And thank you. I hope that was interesting.
Thank you so much, Krystal. That was excellent. I could
Thank
really
you.
see your passion and intelligence, and also lots of experiences behind this research. And sorry for our limited time. That was a great research.
Thank you.
So now we have 10 minutes. I want to open the floor for any questions or comments about Krystal lecture.
Wow.
Yes.
Thanks, Vic.
So it's not a question, but rather, I think maybe 1 or 2 comments. First of all, obviously, thanks very much for doing this work with such a hard work, and with a lot of passion, as Nilo also mentioned. One thing which so like self-determination theory has, as you know, 3 major ideas, right? autonomy, competence, and the third one is relatedness.
Mm-hmm.
So my first observation is that it should come up actually, like these elements come up in the findings or somewhere where you draw our attention that how actually you observe then those three elements, because relatedness, for example, is a very fundamental concept when it comes to intrinsic motivation. And when you were mentioning empowering librarian, so I was actually trying to link that empowering librarian with the relatedness concept. So this is one observation. The other one is about your conceptual model. Obviously, as you are still, I think, trying to like flush its details. So I think it needs a bit more flushing in terms of, like, if there are three concepts, then how they are related with each other, like how they are. So obviously you have these two arrows, but I think it needs a bit more of explication. Right? And so among these three concepts, but also, which I think you did on the next slide, that how these concepts then have what in quantitative methods we call them as, so there are reflective concepts and then there are formative constructs. So then what does it actually include each concept in terms of, so maybe it will be another approach to have on one slide all these three concepts, and also what actually, what factors or concepts, micro concepts are contributing to the formation of these three broader concepts.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, because as for now, I think it doesn't completely bring out all the detailed work which you have done into, but maybe I have missed that, but just these two ideas.
No, Wasim, thank you so much for both of those comments. And in response regarding the self-determination theory, that is unpacked in the actual thesis itself, but I do take your point that using some of that language when I present about it would be helpful just to connect those dots a bit more. Relatedness and everything, that all comes into that agency, that autonomy, the aspect comes into that agency. And yes, so they absolutely do all interconnect, which also sort of addresses your second point about the model itself and the way that I've designed it visually and also explained it. That has been the biggest challenge, other than Microsoft Word, that has been the biggest challenge of the thesis, is trying to figure out how to visualize the thing in my head. That what I see in my head is not exactly what's on the page, and it does have that added layer of detail and things to you, but I find it really difficult to visually represent that in Word in a way that is somewhat translatable to someone who's reading it without me there next. Like it's as Mary said, it's hard ideas that I'm struggling with and I'm trying to visualize here. So yeah, the model itself, I stand by the elements and everything that goes into it, but the actual visual of it is certainly something that I want to continue to work on and to develop and to think about how to add that extra layer and level of detail so that, yeah, all the different aspects that created that model are evident. I just haven't yet figured out how to do that in a way that's clear, not visually overwhelming, because it got real messy for a bit and you couldn't actually read anything. And yeah, but still tells that story, that idea of the model and what it's trying to do. So yeah, if anybody has any suggestions on ways to create conceptual models, please let me know. But thank you, Wasim. Both very helpful comments.
Yeah, thank you, Krystal. There are so many good comments. about your presentation and also your power of using a slide. So you are great in visualizing your ideas and your presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Krystal, did you
Yes.
learn anything that could be applicable to the juvenile justice system where they don't have libraries for children because they say, well, they don't read, so they don't need libraries?
I
Is there
mean, yeah,
anything?
yeah,
Yeah.
I could certainly, I mean, nothing that there's so much data that I collected and so many things that I have that is not in this presentation or even in the thesis that
Yeah.
is worth exploring. And I, off the top of my head, I can absolutely see some things that would support why that's important. I mean, for example, I didn't mention that, Briar Rose High, the student body there, they were largely refugee based or, low socioeconomic income or that sort of demographic. And a lot of them did not speak English as their first language. They are English as an additional language dialect students. And so, they talked about how having access to a library with 30 books per student actually helped them become better academically and understand English and help them integrate into society better and all of that sort of stuff. And it was only possible because the teacher librarian was buying and spending as much money and time as she could to curate a collection that met their reading abilities but also their interests, and then scaffolded their reading journey so that they could improve, so that they could actually then engage in learning and actually reap the benefits of their education. So that in and of itself is just a tiny little finding that we could certainly explore from that perspective as to why providing access to these things is so crucial, not just even if they aren't interested in it at the beginning, like you can get them in with different kinds of reading, just that aesthetic experience.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll keep thinking and talking to you. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Krystal and Jane. Krystal, I'm thinking this presentation might be watched not only by academics, but also by people in industry, teacher, librarian. So at the end, could you give us one piece of advice for an early career teacher librarian who wants to create a stronger reading culture? What would it be from you?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the teacher librarian factor, right? Like you teacher librarians, we are all different individuals. We all have different priorities. We all have different strengths. Some of us are big and bold and loud, and others of us are quiet and sneaky and strategic or whatever. It's okay to do influence in your way that works for you and your school. That I think is the biggest point that I want to drive home. You need to empower your students, but you also need to be empowered. You need to find ways to have an effect that is sustainable within your capacity, that fits within the school's directions, that isn't going to be a huge, undertaking as you as an individual, but anything that you do is going to be worth it. And yeah, there's no limit on what you can do. Just whatever you have the capacity to do.
Thank you. That was great, Krystal. Such a great encouraging suggestions.
Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us. Let us one more time. Thanks, Krystal, for such a great presentation. And yes, that was wonderful. And see you in our next seminar series. Thank you all.
Thank you.